I have entered caves across 3 states. I have crawled through passages no wider than my shoulders, pressed flat against limestone that smelled like iron and old water, my lamp throwing shadows that moved like living things. I have wedged myself through gaps that shouldn't fit a man and come out the other side into chambers that had never seen light. In 20 years of moving through the underground, I had never once felt anything other than the particular pleasure of being somewhere most people would refuse to go. On October 12, 1908, I entered a cave on Pine Mountain, and for the first time in my life, I understood that I was not welcome, not threatened, not endangered, simply not welcome, the way a field mouse is not welcome in a hawk's nest. That is how Carl Quillen began the entry, not the last entry he wrote. He continued the journal for another 40 years, documenting other camps, other mountains, the slow contraction of the old-growth forests across eastern Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia, the way the great hemlocks came down one by one until the ridgelines looked like bare shoulders. He wrote about his wife, about 2 sons, about a Model T that he repaired 17 times and sold for parts in 1931. He wrote, and he filled notebooks, and he sketched in charcoal in the margins. Animals, tree lines, the faces of the men he worked with. But there are 43 pages removed from that journal. 43 pages, cut close to the binding with something sharp. Whatever he wrote in the weeks following October 12, 1908, he cut away. What remains begins again on November 4th, with this sentence: I have told the company the grade is too steep. They believed me. The pages between are gone. What we have instead is the testimony of the men who were on that mountain with him. What we have is Silas Craft's account, given to his nephew in 1934 and written down in a letter that survived 2 house fires. What we have is what Harless Webb told a Methodist congregation in Harlan County in 1921, which was written down by the minister because, as he noted in the margin, this man was not lying. And what we have is Mrs. Ollie Collins, who knew the story already, had known it, or something like it, her whole life, and who told Carl Quillen what he had found before he had finished describing it. Pine Mountain in Letcher County, Kentucky, 1908. Let me take you there. The mountain runs northeast to southwest for nearly 125 miles, one of the longest unbroken ridges in the entire Appalachian chain, rising sometimes to over 3,000 feet, its spine thick with old-growth timber that had never felt an axe, hemlock and white oak, and tulip poplar that had been growing since before the first European maps named anything in this part of the world. The trees were enormous in the way that takes centuries to mean anything. You stood among them, and you lost your sense of scale. The hemlocks had trunks 4 feet across, 5 feet, their bark the color of dried blood, their boughs so dense that the forest floor beneath them stayed damp even in August, carpeted in a deep wet moss that gave under your boots like something alive. The logging companies had been working the lower slopes for years by then, pushing up the hollows with their ox teams and their splash dams and their crews of 50 men who could strip a hillside in a season. The timber was valuable beyond what most people understand today. The old-growth hemlocks were taken not just for lumber, but for their bark, which was stripped and sold to tanneries for the tannin that cured leather. A single old hemlock could yield enough bark to make the labor of felling it worthwhile before a single board was cut. They were worth money dead twice over. Carl Quillen came to Pine Mountain in the fall of 1908 as foreman of a crew contracted to survey the upper ridge and begin cutting what was assessed as the most accessible old-growth timber on the southern face. He was 38 years old. He wore spectacles he kept in a leather case in his breast pocket and removed only when he needed to read or write, which annoyed his crews because he was always stopping to find them when a measurement had to be checked. He was educated past what his position required. He had studied 2 years at a college in Ohio before money ran out and he'd come back to work. And he kept a journal and sketched in charcoal, and the men under him respected him and occasionally found him trying. He was precise. He was curious in ways that could be mistaken for arrogance. Silas Craft was the crew lead. 53 years old, born and raised on Pine Mountain's southern face, the son of a man who had been born there too. He had been rolling logs since he was 14 and had the body to show for it. Thick through the arms and shoulders, a face that had been in weather for 4 decades, and a walk with a slight rock to the left side from the 2 toes he'd lost in a log-rolling accident in 1893. He knew this mountain the way men know, places they have been afraid of and come back to anyway, year after year, because the work was there, and the mountain was there, and what are you going to do? He'd told Carl about it before they'd set foot on the upper ridge. They were still at the base camp the morning before the first ascent, and Silas had come to Carl's tent and stood outside it and said, quietly, the way men say things they expect to be ignored. This mountain has a keeper, my mother told me. Her mother told her, you don't bother the keeper. Carl had written it down. He wrote most things down. He'd noted it under October 9th as local superstition, forested ridgeline, some protective spirit, keeper of the mountain. Silas Craft. And then he'd drawn a small sketch of Silas's face in the margin, the way he always did when someone told him something he thought was worth remembering. Not the story, the face. They found the cave on October 12th. They had been working the upper slope for 3 days, cutting a survey line through timber so dense the noon sun barely reached the forest floor. The smell up there was extraordinary, deep and mineral and alive. The smell of decades of wet hemlock needles composting into something rich and dark. The smell of the rock itself weeping moisture into the roots of trees that were older than the nation. You breathed up there, and it was like breathing something thicker than air. The hemlock came down at mid-morning. It was enormous. Carl measured the stump later and recorded it at 67 inches across, and it fell northeast as they'd planned, crashing through 2 smaller trees before coming to rest on the slope. And when the sound of it stopped, when the cracking and the rushing and the particular deep percussion of several thousand pounds of wood hitting earth finally settled, there was a moment of silence that felt wrong, not quiet, absence. Harless Webb saw it first. Harless was 24. The youngest on the crew by 7 years, wiry in the way of young men who have never stopped moving. With a habit of going places he hadn't been assigned to go because his curiosity was stronger than his judgment. He had already climbed to the top of the fallen hemlock before the dust had settled, walking its length with his arms out for balance like a boy on a fence rail, and it was from that height that he saw the opening. The hemlock's root ball had torn free of the slope in falling, and the cavity left by the roots, maybe 8 feet across, 4 feet deep, had cracked something open in the hillside behind it. Not a sinkhole, not a wash, a passage. A dark aperture about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, cut into the rock with the lip worn smooth the way stone gets worn smooth when something passes over it repeatedly, for a long time. Harless didn't say anything. He climbed down from the hemlock and walked to the opening and crouched in front of it, and Carl Quillen came up behind him and looked over his shoulder. The passage went back into the dark and turned, and from beyond the turn came a current of air. Not cold, warm, and it smelled, Carl wrote this down, like mineral thyme, clean, no decay. The smell of deep stone and something older underneath, something he could only describe as the smell of before. "Don't," said Silas Craft. He was behind them both, leaning on his peavey, and his voice had a flatness to it that wasn't anger and wasn't fear. A kind of foregone conclusion. "Don't go in there." Carl turned and looked at him. "You know this cave? I know the mountain has places you leave alone. How long has it been here?" "Carl. Not Mr. Quillen, just Carl. The way you speak to a man you're trying to reach. I'm telling you." Carl took his spectacles out of their leather case and put them on and looked at the opening again. He had a lamp on his belt. He unhooked it, turned the wick up, and went in. 60 feet. That's how far the passage ran before it opened. He described it in a later fragment of the journal, one that survived, written weeks after the event when he was setting down what he remembered. The passage was narrow for the first 30 feet, then widened gradually. The floor was clay, soft, damp. The walls were limestone, close on both sides and warm to the touch. Not body warm, warmer, like stone that has been near a fire for hours. He moved slowly, partly for care, and partly because his lamp was throwing shadows that confused the geometry of the rock, and partly, he admitted this, because he was listening. The warm air was moving, not a draft, a rhythm. The chamber opened without warning. One step, it was a passage. The next, he was standing in a room. He estimated it at 40 feet across and 20 feet high at the apex. The floor was clay, flat as if it had been worked. The walls were limestone gone smooth, and the ceiling arched above him in a dome that his lamp couldn't quite reach. The warmth was stronger here, pressing against his face, and the smell was stronger too. Deep mineral and something he couldn't name, something that sat at the back of his throat like a word in a language he'd heard once and never learned. He stood still for a while. He didn't write how long. Then he began to document what he saw. The fire pit first, stone ringed in the center of the chamber floor. 8 stones, roughly circular, each one fitted to the next with a care that didn't look accidental. The ash was soft. He touched it with 2 fingers and wrote, "Not warm, but not settled. Recent. Days, not months." The color of the ash was particular. Very pale, almost white, the kind of ash you get from wood burned completely, all the way down, animal skins stacked against the left wall. He couldn't identify all of them, deer, certainly. Something larger he thought was bear. Others that were cured in a way he hadn't seen, pliable, almost soft, with the hair removed and the surface worked to a smoothness he tested with his palm. The stack was neat. Not stored carelessly, arranged. The tools were on a flat ledge of rock near the skins. He spent time with these. Bone, primarily. The bones of large animals, shaped into implements he recognized in function, but not in form. The blades had a geometry unlike anything he'd seen in museum cases or illustrated books. The angles were wrong. Not cruder than the tools he knew, different, as if the person who made them had arrived at function through a different path of reasoning, a different logic of the hand. He sketched them, all of them. He had his charcoal in his jacket pocket, and he sketched everything: the pit, The skins, the tools, the walls, the shape of the chamber. He was precise. He was always precise. It took him the better part of an hour. Then he turned to the far wall. The marks covered most of the visible surface, from roughly 4 feet off the floor to as high as anyone standing could reach, and they covered at least 20 feet of wall horizontally. Charcoal and ochre. The ochre a deep reddish brown, the charcoal black, and the two used in alternation in a pattern he had to look at for a while before he understood it was a pattern. Groups. Long series of marks, vertical tallies, 4 with a diagonal 5th, the universal counting stroke, but grouped in clusters of roughly 30, and those clusters themselves grouped in sets of 12, and those sets separated from one another by a larger ochre mark, a circle with a line through it, repeated again and again down the wall. He counted the sets. He stopped at 400. There may have been more. The wall curved slightly, and his lamp didn't reach the far edge. He stood there with his charcoal in his hand, and he looked at 400 sets of marks, each set containing approximately 365 individual strokes, each set separated by the same symbol, repeated without variation, across what appeared to be decades of careful, consistent work. He put his spectacles back in their case. He put his charcoal in his jacket. He turned around and walked back through the 60 feet of warm passage and came out into the daylight on Pine Mountain's southern slope, where 9 men were standing in a loose semicircle around the cave entrance, not speaking. Silas was watching him, not the way you watch a man for news, the way you watch a man who has been somewhere you knew he shouldn't go, and now he's back, and you're waiting to find out what it cost him. "I need to document this properly," Carl said. His voice was steady. "I'll need to come back." Silas said nothing. "Silas, there's something in there, something important, historical. Someone has been living in that cave and keeping records for—" He stopped. He looked down at his hand. The charcoal had left a smear across his palm from all the sketching. He rubbed at it with his thumb. 400 years, he said, at minimum. "I know," said Silas Craft. The singing started that night. The crew had made camp 300 yards down the slope from the cave entrance, in a clearing between 2 large oaks where the ground was level enough to sleep on and the fire had good draw. They had eaten, and most of the men were in their bedrolls, or getting there, and the mountain was doing what mountains do at night, settling, creaking, all the small sounds of something very large, breathing slowly in the dark. Harless Webb was the first one awake. He would say later that he couldn't explain why he woke. He'd simply opened his eyes and known something was different, some quality of the night air, and he'd lain there in his bedroll, listening until he could identify it. A woman's voice, coming from up the slope, from the direction of the cave. He said later, in that Methodist church in Harlan County, with the minister's pen moving across the page behind him. It wasn't English. It wasn't Cherokee. It wasn't anything I'd heard or anything I could get my mouth around. It was just a woman's voice and words that were older than words. That's the only way I know to say it, like the words were from before words were a thing people made. He lay there listening for a long time. Then he sat up and looked around the camp and found that he was not the only one awake. Carl was sitting up, 3 other men, all of them still, all of them facing upslope. Silas was already sitting up, which meant Silas had already been awake, which meant Silas had been waiting for this. "How long has it been here?" Carl had asked about the cave. Silas hadn't answered that question. He was answering it now, obliquely, in the only way that felt honest to him, by already knowing. The singing continued for what Harless estimated as 20 minutes. Carl wrote that it seemed longer. He wrote that time moved differently while it was happening. Not slow, not fast, just different. Like looking at something from an angle you hadn't used before. When it stopped cleanly, mid-breath it seemed, and the silence after it had a texture to it, the way silence does after a sound that was large. Nobody spoke for a while. "I told you," said Silas finally. Not angry, not "I told you so," just the flat, returned truth of it. "Leave her mountain alone." "Her," said Harless. Silas looked at him. "What do you think a keeper is?" Carl went back twice before he went to see Mrs. Ollie Collins. The second visit was the next morning, early, before the crew was up. He went alone, and he documented everything again. The wall marks, the tools, the fire pit, taking measurements this time, pacing the chamber's dimensions, checking the ash again. Still soft, still pale. The skins were exactly where they'd been. Nothing moved. The warmth in the rock walls was the same. He was there for an hour and a half and saw nothing, heard nothing, and when he left, he noticed. He stopped and looked down at the clay floor near the entrance to the passage, that there was a footprint. He had walked in the same ground yesterday, and it had held no prints but his own. This one was new, small, bare. The print of a woman's foot, complete from heel to the long sweep of the toes, pressed into the clay at a slight angle, as if the person had been walking and paused mid-step. The depth of it. He knelt and measured it against his own hand. Not a child. An adult woman, small and light-footed, who had walked into or out of this passage after Carl had left the night before, and before he'd come back this morning. He stood up. He stood very still. Somewhere above him, somewhere in the rock of the mountain, the warm air moved. He sketched the footprint. He measured it, 7 inches, with a high arch, narrow heel. He sketched it 3 times from different angles. Then he walked back to camp and sat down at his supply crate that served as a desk, and opened his journal and wrote for 20 minutes, and then he closed the journal and sat looking at the trees. The third time he saw her was 2 nights later. He was returning from a walk along the ridgeline. He walked evenings when he couldn't sit still, and the light was going, that particular late autumn dusk where everything goes blue-gray and the trees become silhouettes before the sky does. He was 300 feet below the cave entrance when he looked up. She was standing at the mouth of the cave, a silhouette, small, very still. The cave entrance behind her was darker than the rock around it, and she was darker than the cave. Long hair past her waist. She was not looking at him, or if she was, he couldn't tell from the angle and the light. She was simply standing there, the way you stand in your own doorway. He stopped walking. He stood completely still. She was there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she stepped back, and the entrance was empty. He wrote it down. He described what he'd seen with the care of a man who knows he will doubt himself later. Female figure, small, hair unbound, and very long. Standing in the cave entrance at approximately 5:40 p.m. on October 14th. She did not appear to see me, or she appeared not to see me. I cannot determine which. Then a line by itself. The distinction matters. He put away his journal and his spectacles, and he went to find Silas. And what he said was, "Tell me who I can talk to. Tell me who knows the stories about this mountain." And Silas said, without hesitation, the way he'd had the name ready. Ollie Collins. She's down in Blackie. You go on a Sunday. Mrs. Ollie Collins was 64 years old that fall, and she had been a midwife and herbalist in that part of Letcher County for 30 of those years, which meant she had been in more homes, sat beside more beds, known more bodies and more births and more deaths than anyone else in a 20-mile radius. She had the authority of women who carry knowledge men dismiss, which is a very particular kind of authority, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition and doesn't require it, because it has outlasted everyone who ever refused to give it. She lived on the edge of Blackie in a house with a kitchen garden that she kept better than the house, with dried things hanging from every rafter and a fire that was always going, winter and summer both. She was a small woman. She kept her gray hair pulled back tight, and she had hands that were rough from work and precise from decades of careful use. And when Carl came to her door on a Sunday in late October, hat in hand, she looked at him for a moment with no expression and said, "You're from the logging crew on Pine Mountain." It wasn't a question. He told her what he'd found. He sat at her kitchen table and he described the cave, the dimensions, the fire pit, the skins, the tools, the wall, the marks. He told her he'd counted to 400 before running out of light and wall. He told her about the footprint, the singing, the figure at the cave mouth. Mrs. Collins listened without interrupting. She was doing something with her hands the whole time, sorting dried plants, separating stems, her hands moving with that habitual economy of someone who does not waste motion. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She set down what she was holding. She said, "How old do you think those marks are?" "If each group represents a year," Carl said, "and there are 400 groups, at minimum, then 400 years at minimum. Possibly more if the earlier marks have faded or the wall continues past where I could see." Mrs. Collins looked at the fire. Her face had done something he described later as going pale under the skin, as if the blood had moved back. Not fear. Confirmation of something she had hoped was less true than it was. "My grandmother told me about the keeper," she said. "Her grandmother told her. It went back like that. Every woman in my line knew the story, the way you know stories that are too old to question. The mountain has a keeper. She's been there since before any of us." She paused. She looked back at him. "Before the Cherokee, Carl. You understand what I'm telling you? My grandmother said she was here when the first Cherokee walked these ridges. She was here when they arrived." Carl was quiet. "That was 1,000 years ago," Mrs. Collins said. "More, maybe, depending on who you ask and which trail they say was first. Your 400 marks." She shook her head, very slightly. "That's what she bothered to count, or all she counted. You don't know where those marks start, do you? You don't know if that wall is the first wall." He had not considered that. The look on his face told her he hadn't, and she gave him a moment with it. "She's not a settler," Mrs. Collins said. "She's not a hermit. She's not the descendant of anyone who came here. My grandmother said, and her grandmother said, that she doesn't own the mountain. She is the mountain's memory. Everything that has happened on that mountain, every tree that grew there, every animal that was born and died on that ridge, every rain and every drought and every season. She holds all of it. She's the place knowing itself." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire cracked once. Carl was looking at his hands, which were folded on the table, and he was doing the arithmetic. Not of the marks, he'd already done that, but of something else. Of what it meant that he had walked into that chamber and touched those tools and counted those marks and sketched that footprint. Of what it meant that she'd known he was there and had let him be. "She let me in," he said. Mrs. Collins looked at him steadily. "Yes. Why?" "I don't know why." She picked up the dried plants again. Her hands resumed their sorting. "I don't know that it needs a reason you'd understand. Maybe she decided it was time for someone to know." She glanced up at him once. "Or maybe you were just interesting to her, for a little while." He swallowed, twice. "Should I go back?" he asked. Collins sorted 3 stems to the left and 1 to the right before she answered. "That's yours to decide," she said, "but I'll tell you this. Whatever you decide, don't bring anyone else, and don't think you're doing her a favor." She looked at him again, and this time the look stayed. "She was here before the trees you're cutting. She'll be here when there's nothing left of you but a name on a company payroll. You go back if you need to. Go back because you need to. Not because you think she needs anything from you." Carl walked back to Pine Mountain. This is where the journal pages are missing, the 43 pages. Whatever happened in the 20 days between October 12th and November 4th, whatever Carl Quillen wrote in the hours and days immediately following Mrs. Collins' kitchen, it's gone, cut clean. What we have instead is this. On the night of October 29th, 1908, Harless Webb heard the singing again. He was the only one awake. He said it lasted longer this time, maybe an hour. He said it was different, not in melody. There was no melody in the way he understood melody, but in something else, something he couldn't name, something he described as tone. Like the mountain was saying something different than before. Like it knew something had changed. He did not know, lying there in his bedroll, that Carl was not in camp. Carl's bedroll was empty. Had been empty, Harless realized, since he'd last looked before sleeping. He would have said something, but the singing was still going, and he had the specific feeling. He told the Methodist congregation this plainly, with no apparent embarrassment, that he should not move, that moving would be wrong in a way he couldn't explain, that something was happening on the mountain that required stillness from everyone in the camp. So he lay still, and the voice carried through the dark, and he did not know where Carl was. Carl came back before dawn. He came into camp quietly, the way a man moves when he doesn't want to wake anyone, and he went to his bedroll and sat on it with his jacket still on and his spectacles in his hands. Not in the case, but in his hands, turning them over and over. Harless watched through half-closed eyes, the way you watch when you know you're not supposed to be watching. Carl sat like that for a long time. Then he put the spectacles in their case and lay down. He never spoke about that night. The next morning he was himself, precise, organized, directing the crew's work with the same measured competence he always had. He made no mention of where he'd been. He gave no indication that anything had happened. 43 pages, cut clean. What he did write, what survived, is the account of his final visit to the cave. He wrote it weeks later, in November, after the decision about the timber had already been made. He was no longer on Pine Mountain. He wrote it the way you write something you need to get outside yourself, where you can look at it. I entered the cave on the evening of October 29th, alone. I had told no one. I carried my lamp and my charcoal and my journal, though I did not write in the journal while I was inside. I did not write anything. I only looked. The passage was the same, warm, the walls warm under my hands where I steadied myself. I moved through it slowly, not from caution, but from something that felt close to ceremony, though I am not a ceremonial man. 60 feet, and then the chamber. The fire was lit. Not a large fire, a small one, a few pieces of wood burning evenly with the low orange light that a controlled fire makes, the light of a fire that has been built by someone who knows fire. The chamber was warm and the shadows moved on the wall. I stood in the passage entrance and I did not go farther. She came in from somewhere I could not identify. There may be passages I didn't find, or she came in past me while I was stopped, though I don't see how that is possible in that passage. She was simply in the chamber. She had not been there, and then she was. Small, smaller than I had thought from the silhouette at the cave mouth. Dark hair very long, past her waist, loose, the color of the cave walls, skin the color of the clay floor. She moved to the fire and sat down beside it, cross-legged, with a fluidity that was not quite the way people move, not quite the way animals move. Something between, or something else entirely that I don't have a word for. She did not acknowledge me. She sat with her back to the passage and looked at the fire. I watched her for 10 minutes. I know it was 10 minutes because I was counting, the way you count when you need your mind to be doing something. She did not move, except to tend the fire once, reaching out with one hand and adjusting a piece of wood, with the casual precision of someone who has done this more times than they could ever count. Then she rose and went to the wall. She had a piece of charcoal or ochre in her hand. I hadn't seen her take it up, it was simply there. She went to the wall where the marks were, and she found the end of the last row, and she added marks, 7 of them. She made each one carefully. Then she paused and added an 8th, and there was something in the 8th mark, something in the slight hesitation before it, the particular pressure she used, that made me understand, suddenly, with a certainty that had no basis in logic, that she was not marking years. Years were not what she was counting. I have thought about it since, for weeks now, and I cannot determine what it was she was marking. 1 per year, or something that happens with that frequency. A migration, a flowering, an event in the life of the mountain itself that follows a cycle I don't understand. Something seen, something witnessed, not time. The occasions of something she watches for. I will not pretend to know what. She finished and stepped back from the wall. She turned her head. Her profile. That is all I saw. The left side of her face in firelight, the line of her jaw and brow, and the curve of her nose. Her eye. I wrote in my journal, later, from memory, because I did not write it then, that she was not old and not young. That is not precise enough. What I mean is that age had not touched her, not preserved. Not the way the word preserved works, meaning something resisting a process that is still happening. The process simply had not reached her, as if time was a weather she had always lived indoors from. She looked at me. I want to be exact about what I felt in that moment, because I have been asked later by people who heard pieces of this story whether I was afraid, whether I felt threatened, whether I felt the presence of something hostile or dangerous. I felt none of those things. I felt the following. I felt that I was very small, not metaphorically, not in the way that standing at the edge of the ocean makes you feel small, where you also feel the pleasure of the bigness, and you are still, underneath the smallness, the measure of things. This was a different kind of smallness, the kind where the measuring is not yours to do, the kind where you are not the center of the frame. I felt, clearly and absolutely, that I was irrelevant, not dismissed, not insignificant in the way a person is insignificant when they are ignored, irrelevant in the way a season is irrelevant, not to be thought about, simply there, simply a condition, simply one of the things that happened while she was watching for what she actually watches for. She looked at me for what felt like a very long time and was probably 3 seconds. Then she looked away, back to the fire. I left. I walked the 60 feet back through the warm passage and out into the cold night air of Pine Mountain's southern slope, and I stood there with my lamp still burning and the mountain dark above me, and I understood with complete clarity that I would not come back. Not because it was forbidden, not because she had told me to go. She had not said a word, had not looked at me with warning, had made no gesture in my direction that could be read as threat or command. I would not come back because there was nothing here for me to do. There was nothing here for me to find, nothing to study, nothing to take or report or document that would be of use to anyone. She was not a discovery. She was not a subject. She was here before the concept of documentation existed, and she will be here after the last document has crumbled. And the best I could do, the most honest thing I could do, was to walk out and leave her to the mountain, and the mountain to her. I did not take my sketches. I left them in the chamber, on the flat ledge near the skins. I don't know why. It seemed right. Carl Quillen told the company the grade on the upper south face of Pine Mountain was too steep for profitable harvest. He submitted a report with measurements he had adjusted slightly from the actual figures. The contract was redirected to a section of the lower ridge. Silas Kraft, when Carl told him what he was doing, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The grade, huh?" "Yes," Carl said. "Too steep." "That's right." Silas nodded once, the slow and single nod of a man confirming something he already believed. He said, "All right then." And he turned and walked back to where the crew was working, and the subject was never raised between them again. He thanked Carl in his way. It was the way of men of that time and place, and a certain particular quietness. Not words, but an absence of the friction that might have been there, a smoothing over that Silas extended in the days before the crew left, checking on Carl's equipment, handing him a cup of coffee once without being asked. Carl noticed. He wrote it down. I suspect Silas knew I was lying. He thanked me anyway. The upper ridge of Pine Mountain's southern face was not logged in 1908. It was not logged in 1909 or 1910 or the years following, by which time the company had moved on to other tracts and Carl Quillen had moved to a different district and was writing different entries in different journals. The great hemlock that came down on October 12th, the one whose falling had opened the cave entrance, lay where it fell for years, slowly decaying into the slope, returning to the soil molecule by molecule, becoming something else. The cave entrance was not found again. Harless Webb went looking for it twice, in 1909 and again in 1914, and couldn't find it. Not because the terrain had changed much. The slope was roughly the same, the rock face roughly the same. He simply couldn't find the opening. He told the Methodist congregation it was like looking for a door in a wall, and the wall had just decided to be a wall. Spelunkers have searched Pine Mountain for decades. Geologists doing karst surveys in the 1940s and again in the 1960s, documented the cave systems along the ridge in detail. There are notable cave formations in the area, documented entrances, mapped passages, photographed chambers. None of them match what Carl described. Not the dimensions, not the clay floor, not the fire pit, not the marks on the wall. Pine Mountain is now a state park. The trees Carl was sent to cut have regrown. The hemlock and the tulip poplar and the oak coming back across a century, and while they are not yet the size of the old growth, they are getting there, patient in the way of things that have time. Hikers walk the ridgeline. People come on weekends to look at the view, to feel the particular depth of an Appalachian forest, to breathe that air that is always slightly different up there, denser, older smelling, as if the trees are exhaling something from a long way back. The cave has not been found. In 1997, a woman named Ruth Gilliam, a folklorist at a Kentucky university, was conducting interviews in Letcher County for a project on oral tradition and came across a reference to the story in a letter in a local archive. She traced it to Mrs. Ollie Collins, who had died in 1931, and from there to Collins's granddaughter, then in her 70s, who agreed to speak with her. The interview is archived at the university library. The relevant portion has been transcribed. "The cave moves," the granddaughter said. "It's not in one place. Grandmother said that. Her grandmother said that. It goes wherever she goes. The cave is her. Do you understand? It's not a place she lives. It's part of what she is." When they felled that hemlock in 1908 and the entrance showed up, that wasn't an accident of geology. She allowed it. When the foreman went in, that wasn't him being brave. She let him. She decided it was time for someone to know. A pause in the transcript. The interviewer wrote, subject paused for approximately 15 seconds before the next line. And then she moved, and the cave moved with her, and that was that. That's how that works. That's always been how that works. Ruth Gilliam asked, "Know what? What did she want them to know?" Another pause. That she was here. The granddaughter's voice, the interviewer noted, was very even when she said this. Not emotional. The way you say things that are simply facts. That she's been here. That she was counting something and she's still counting it and we don't know what it is. And that's fine. That's not ours to know. She just wanted someone to know that she was here and that she was watching and that all those trees and all that rock and all that rain going back to before anything, it wasn't empty. It was never empty. A breath. It was never empty, and someone was home, and we came and started cutting, and she watched us do it, and she didn't stop us. The transcript ends there. What Carl Quillen knew at the end is this. The marks on the wall were not a record of years. They were a count of something that happened with the frequency of a year, but was not a year. He never determined what. Nobody has. What Mrs. Collins knew, what her grandmother knew, what the line of women before her had carried across generations in a county where things get carried that way, through kitchen tables and dried herbs, and the particular knowledge of women who attend births and deaths and all the large events of a life, is that Pine Mountain had a keeper, and the keeper was something older than the concept of indigenous, something older than any category of presence that human language has developed, not a god, not a spirit in any traditional sense. The awareness of a place knowing itself, the mountain attending to what the mountain holds. What Silas Craft knew, growing up in his mother's house on the southern face, was simply, don't bother the keeper. He knew it without elaboration, without mythology, without needing to understand the specifics. The mountain had something in it that had been there since before his family, before anyone's family, before the concept of a family. You leave that alone. You don't go in where you're not invited. What Harless Webb knew, and what he said out loud in that Methodist church with the congregation around him and the minister's pen moving, was that a woman's voice had come out of Pine Mountain in the dark, and the words were older than words, and he had lain still and listened, and something in the listening had changed him in a way he couldn't name, and he was not sorry. What we know, what we can hold, is smaller than any of that. There is a Pine Mountain in Letcher County, Kentucky, and it has been there for longer than any human presence in Appalachia can account for. The forests on its ridges have been cut and have regrown and may be cut again. The stone underneath is limestone, karst-riddled, full of passages that water has carved over millions of years, passages that connect and separate and shift as the mountain breathes its geological breath, slow and enormous. Somewhere in that stone, the air is warm. It moves in a rhythm that isn't quite wind. The walls are warm to the touch. And somewhere in the soft clay of a chamber floor, there are footprints, small, bare, pressed carefully into the clay, the high arch and the narrow heel and the long reach of the toes, the print of someone walking, not arriving, not leaving, just walking. The ordinary motion of someone in a place that belongs to them, going from one thing to the next, unhurried, attending to what they attend to. One more mark on the wall, another year of whatever she is counting. She was here before the hemlocks, and the hemlocks grew 4 feet across in 300 years of silence, and we came and cut them down and thought we were the first thing to matter to this mountain. And in a cave somewhere in the limestone, underneath our feet, a woman watched us come and watched us go and picked up her charcoal and made a mark, and we still don't know what the mark means. And she is still counting.